Hi guys, welcome to the Fluid, Electrolytes, and Acid-Base Balance lecture. We're going to identify the body's main fluid compartments, identify the 6 most important ions and the function of the body. We're going to define buffer and discuss the roles of buffers in the body. We're going to explain why bicarbonate must be conserved rather than reabsorbed in the kidneys, and identify the normal range of blood pH, and name some conditions where one has a blood pH that is either too high or too low. So if you remember, we're just going to do a quick little chemistry review. Solutes are the dissolved substances within a solution. So for instance, if you had salt water, the salt itself is the solute. Okay. Electrolytes are just ions. So this is our minerals that have been disassociated from a salt, and they have an electrical charge. So sodium, for instance, calcium, chloride. Cations are positively charged, anions are negatively charged, right? So sodium and calcium, those would be both considered cations, whereas the chloride ion is considered an anion. Okay? Osmosis is the diffusion of water from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And the water is going to move most frequently in response to the salt movement. A buffer is a solution that resists the changes in pH when an acid or an alkali is added to it. So buffers are usually with a weak acid or an alkali together with another salt. And then the chemical reactions within the body take place within an aqueous environment. Our body is mostly made up of water. Okay. So this is just a good review of what our water content in our body is. Our brain is 80 to 85% of water, lungs 75 to 80%, liver 70 to 75%. Our blood is just 50%. I think that's probably shocking for most people. Our bones 20 to 25%. So this is sort of when we look at our composition of our human body, okay? So we have a ton of proteins, a ton of lipids, minerals, carbohydrates, and then some miscellaneous things. And then we can look at our water, okay? The water is going to be either here within our intracellular fluid, in our extracellular fluid, and that can also be divided further into our interstitial fluid, the plasma, and then even solids are going to contain some water. Okay. So we have some different fluid compartments in order to hold all that water, right? So we have that intracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid means that it's inside of the cell, okay? And then we have extracellular fluid. This would be fluid that's outside of the cell. So some of it is going to be the interstitial fluid. And the plasma. Okay. And so you can see here, this is interstitial fluid. It's interstitial fluid because it's between the tissues or between the cells, is kind of that idea. Okay. So, and this is a comparison of females and males. So on the male side, right, males are just 40% solid, females 50% solid. Okay. And then, so because of that, females have about 50% water, whereas males are 60% water. This is showing us the cations and the anions found within the body. Okay, so the cations, again, those are going to be positively charged. In the extracellular fluid, that means on the outside of the cell, we have way more sodium. We've talked about that when we talked about action potential. And then in the intracellular fluid, we have a lot more potassium. We also have magnesium in there. And then in the anions, okay, we have those chloride ions that we've talked about before. We also have the bicarbonate. So remember, we have the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium and the potassium, they can sometimes leak through pores into and out of the cell. But high levels of potassium and low levels of the sodium within that intracellular fluid are maintained because of that pump. So remember, we have 3 sodium out for every 2 potassium in. So we're going to sometimes have to exchange that fluid, right? And so some of that exchange of fluid, right, is that we're going to, this is the cell membrane, this little line representing the cell membrane, right? And so that within the cell, we can make metabolic generation of water, right? So about 300 milliliters. That's going to be absorbed into that extracellular fluid. And then from the extracellular fluid, we're going to lose some through urine, respiratory losses, fecal loss, when we sweat, that kind of idea. But then we also have more coming in through our digestive epithelium. Okay. So when we have our extracellular fluid and our intracellular fluid are in balance, these two solutions, we would call them isotonic. They have the same number of solutes sort of spread out within the water content. Okay. When we have water loss, like we become dehydrated, okay, that's going to make the solution more hypertonic here in relationship to our intracellular fluid here, right? Because we sort of pushed those solutes down, so it's more concentrated now, okay? And so when this happens, where would the water shift? Where would the water shift here? The water would shift over here. It wants to spread it out, right? Make sure that those solutes are spread out evenly, okay? And so when that happens, we would have a decrease in our intracellular volume now, and we would increase that extracellular fluid volume, okay? So this would be that water would shift, so that would be the osmotic or the osmosis shift here. And this happens during dehydration, right? So our cells, initially at the cellular level, they're not necessarily dehydrated when we ourselves are dehydrated, right? First, we would kind of hit this point where we would be losing the water out of our extracellular fluid volume, and we wouldn't be pulling more in, okay? And because of that, our cells start to shrink because the water would move over. So remember, when we move fluid, okay, we have that two different sort of pressures that we've talked about. We have that osmotic force. That osmotic force is created by the osmotic gradient. So remember, we have these solutes on one side of a semi-permeable membrane, okay? And so the water is going to move by osmosis to the area where the solutes are more concentrated. This is our pull-in mechanism that we talked about before, right? Or our reabsorption. And then we have the hydrostatic, and the hydrostatic is the force exerted by a fluid against the wall. When we turn on our spigot of our water hose, right, it's forced against that outside of the water hose. It makes it hard on the outside. It's harder to bend that water hose, okay? And so this happens with that fluid exerted against a wall. So this is our push out, right? So we've talked about, right, we had that push out happening here on the arterial end because the hydrostatic pressure was much higher, okay? The venous end, we end up with that higher osmotic pressure, so we get reabsorption. Then we also have the movement of solutes. So solutes, they can be moved actively or passively. So when we do active transport, it requires energy. And this is when we usually are moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. We're squishing the people together like those in the elevator, right? And then the passive transport is when we have no energy required. So diffusion occurs. We're moving from an area of high to an area of low. This is when everybody just sort of floods out of that elevator because they're uncomfortable, okay? We also can have what's called facilitated transport, and this is when a molecule moves through a special protein, but it doesn't necessarily require any energy. We've already talked about these hormones. We've talked about them ad nauseum, but hopefully the reason that you see them keep coming back is because they will return in your studies, okay? And so we've talked about this RAA pathway several times, okay? And so when our extracellular volume has increased by a fluid gain, right? When we have more fluid in our body, that increases our blood volume. It also increases our atrial distension, which means that that pressure has been increased, right? And so what do we do when that occurs? Okay, we want to stop the water intake and get rid of more, right? So we decrease our aldosterone release, and so that's going to increase our urinary sodium loss, which therefore can increase our urinary water loss, right? Because the water is going to follow the salt, okay? We decrease our ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and so that's going to decrease our thirst, and we're going to decrease our water intake, okay? And hopefully we'll go back to homeostasis. We also, our extracellular volume has decreased by fluid loss, so we've either had a significant loss in blood, but most often this is during a dehydration, or even a permanent dehydration. We can decrease our blood volume and our blood pressure. We can increase the renin, and we start that RAA pathway. right? So, so we increase our aldosterone, that increases our urinary sodium retention. Remember, when we retain it, it retains within our blood. So that decreases our water loss. We're concentrating that urine more, okay, because we use that ADH, right? ADH is going to incent those aquaporins, and so we're going to reabsorb the water. And we're going to, that ADH is also going to increase our thirst, so we're going to increase our water intake, hopefully. So this is just sort of another way to show all of that, right? When we can change our input and our output, right? And so when we change our input, we usually are we're working with the hypothalamus to stimulate the thirst center. When we increase our thirst, hopefully we also increase our fluid intake, okay? And then we can also change our output, and when we change our output, we're usually doing that with the insertion of the aquaporins through ADH. The 6 most important ions within your body are sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, calcium, and phosphate. Sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, calcium, and phosphate. We should probably say those again. Sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, calcium, and phosphate. Okay. It probably spells some cool word that I haven't seen yet, but there's no vowels, so I can't imagine that it actually spells a word. Okay. So sodium is an extracellular ion. So remember, we have most of that sodium on the outside of the cell. Okay, to start, it gets filtered within our glomerular capillaries. Remember that glomerulus is within our kidneys, and it's responsible for about half of the osmotic pressure gradient. We can have hyponatremia. Hyponatremia means that we have too little sodium within our body. It can cause swelling of our cells, decreased oxygen capabilities, and it can eventually lead to death. Just so you know, most of these can eventually lead to death. Okay? Hypernatremia is when we have too much sodium, and what happens when you have too much salt, or at least when I have too much salt. Honestly, I get excessively thirsty. You also can feel lethargy or really tired, and you can get muscle spasms. We could probably talk about those muscle spasms if you think about that depolarization, right? And so if you have too much sodium, then we're going to see that it's going to start sort of filtering into the, more is going to filter into the cells, which is going to cause it to be sort of leaky, a leaky channel idea. And then it's going to cause us to depolarize. You guys can't see my hands, but I'm moving them up in that depolarization fashion that we talked about when we talked about action potential. Okay, it's going to cause our cells to shrink. Our brain cells specifically can shrink, and that can lead to death. Potassium. Remember, potassium is inside of our cell. Our cell is okay. We put that potassium inside, and it's going to help establish our resting membrane potential. Hypokalemia is when we have too little potassium. Okay, we can do that through starvation most often, or through excessive vomiting, diarrhea. We call this sometimes, we can get it through alkalosis. When it's going to cause a hyperpolarization of the cell. So when it's hyperpolarized, we have too much potassium inside. That means that we can't move our ions the way that we want to. It can cause us to have some muscle cramping. Maybe you've experienced like a Charlie horse before, and people tell you to eat a banana because the bananas have a lot of potassium. Okay. Hyperkalemia is when we increase our dietary intake. So we have a lot of potassium. We've eaten way too many bananas. This is unlikely for us to do it to ourselves, but it can happen. And it impairs the function of our skeletal muscles, our nervous system, and our heart. And the reason that it does that is because it does a partial depolarization of the cells all the time. So our heart doesn't relax. Then we can't have a refill of our ventricles. That can seize up and also lead to death. Chloride is an extracellular ion, and remember that helps us to maintain our colloid osmotic pressure. Okay, we can have hyperchloremia or hypochloremia. Okay, and so for hyperchloremia, that's what happened during times of dehydration. It can also happen during Cushing's syndrome. Even severe diarrhea can cause this, and respiratory acidosis. Hypochloremia happens during excessive vomiting, Addison's disease, and respiratory alkalosis. So we also can do bicarbonate. So remember, bicarbonate, we've talked about how it's transported or carbon dioxide is transported within our blood, and one of that is through bicarbonate. Okay, and the reason that we do that is because it helps us to maintain our blood pH as a buffer. We need that blood pH to stay between 7.35 and 7.45, because if it doesn't, then our enzymes cannot work effectively in our body. Because enzymes are proteins, and when proteins are exposed to an acid or base, they start to denature or uncoil and unwind, and then they cannot be functional anymore, right? So it's really important that our blood stays at a certain pH level, okay? Now remember, carbon dioxide is produced in really large amounts by our tissues because our tissues are always doing cellular respiration. That carbon dioxide gets converted into bicarbonate in the cytoplasm of our red blood cells. They do that through that enzymatic action of anhydrase, carbonic anhydrase. And then the bicarbonate then gets transported to the lungs. Once it gets to the lungs, that reaction reverses direction, and then the carbon dioxide can be regenerated from the bicarbonate, and we can exhale it as metabolic waste. Calcium, just fun fact, there's 2 pounds of calcium found within your bones. We need the calcium for muscle contraction, all of our enzyme activities, the release of neurotransmitters and hormones, right? Hypocalcemia, we could get that through hypoparathyroidism after you might remove your thyroid, or even lack of vitamin D, because remember, we need that vitamin D in order to absorb the calcium. It can also be dietary. This can cause muscle cramps, confusion, and tingling in the lips and the fingers. And hyperkalemia means that we're having hyperparathyroidism or even some cancers. This will cause increased thirst and urination, belly pain, nausea, bone pain, muscle weakness, confusion, fatigue, and an abnormal heart rate. Phosphate. This is present within 3 forms of our body. So remember, we have it in our phospholipids, like those in the cell membrane. We also have it in ATP, like adenosine triphosphate. And adenosine triphosphate is specifically a nucleotide, and then as buffers, right? So phospholipids, nucleotides, and buffers. Okay, that's where we're going to find the phosphate. And just remember that ATP is in fact a nucleotide. Hypophosphatemia is when we have too little phosphate. This can happen when we use too many antacids like Tums. Okay, alcohol withdrawal causes this, and so if you would just imagine what severe alcohol withdrawal looks like, if you've ever seen that maybe in a movie or you've seen it or experienced it yourself, it causes muscle weakness, respiratory, heart failure, seizures, and coma can even occur. Hyperphosphatemia is when we have too much phosphate. It can happen during decreased renal function, some leukemias, and significant cell damage. This can accompany hypocalcemia, and it causes tetany, which is when we lock up our muscles. Now, remember, always are maintaining that acid-base balance. Okay, so we have those chemical buffers in the blood. They can adjust the pH of our bodies within seconds. This is bicarbonate. Within seconds, it can change our acid-base balance within our blood. So whether we're converting that carbon dioxide into bicarbonate or not. Okay, we also have some phosphate buffers that can do this. Remember, we can, in our respiratory tract, we can exhale that extra carbon dioxide. That takes a few minutes. And then within our renal system, we can excrete hydrogen ions and conserve our bicarbonate. And so that takes hours to days. Okay, so we want to conserve that bicarbonate rather frequently within our renal system, because we want to be able to use it within seconds to minutes rather than hours to days. Okay, so we conserve that bicarbonate in our renal system so it can come here instead. It gives us more control or faster control over our acid-base balance. Okay, this is showing us that relationship between the pressure of carbon dioxide with our blood, within our blood, and the plasma pH. We've kind of already talked about this because we've talked a lot about carbon dioxide and its conversion over to carbonic acid or bicarbonate when we talked in the respiratory system. So we can have our respiratory regulation of acid-base balance, okay? And so we can have either acidosis or alkalosis. These are both respiratory disorders, respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, okay? And so respiratory acidosis happens when we have acidic blood, which means that our pH has gone down, okay? When that happens, we stimulate the brain and arterial receptors. We increase our respiratory rate, and that helps us to decrease our blood carbon dioxide level. And therefore decrease our blood carbonic acid level, and that's going to then increase our pH back up to a base level. Okay. We can also have respiratory acidosis or alkalosis. And when we have respiratory alkalosis, that means that our pH is too high. We're on the base side of our acid-base balance. Okay. That's going to stimulate our brain and arterial receptors as well to decrease our respiratory rate. Okay. When we decrease our respiratory rate, we're going to get us a blood carbon dioxide level is going to go up. Our blood carbonic acid level can go up. And then our pH can go back down to normal. So remember, we have our renal regulation of acid-base balance. Okay, so sodium ions are reabsorbed from our filtrate, and they do that in exchange with a hydrogen ion. They do that at an antiport in the apical membranes of the cell. So there's just an exchange where the sodium and the hydrogens are exchanged for one another. Okay, and then the cells can produce that bicarbonate ions that can be shunted into our peritubular capillaries. When carbon dioxide is available, the reaction is driven, right, by that carbonic acid, and that dissociates to form that bicarbonate ion and the hydrogen ion. The bicarbonate ion can then pass into those peritubular capillaries and return to the blood. The hydrogen ion can be secreted in the filtrate, where it can be part of the new water molecules and then be reabsorbed, or it can be removed within the urine. Okay. Remember our lungs, this is happening within our lungs, right? This is our our bicarbonate anhydrase ion can move us back and forth as we need to. This is just respiratory acidosis and alkalosis in another graphical organizer for you. Respiratory alkalosis is relatively rare, but respiratory acidosis is not. We see it pretty commonly in patients. We see it in burn victims pretty often, smokers, people who have pneumonia can even have this occur. So what are some disorders of the acid-base balance? So remember that alkalosis is very uncommon. We don't see it very frequently, but some of those alkalosis symptoms is that we can see confusion, lightheadedness, stupor, even coma, hand tremor, numbness or tingling in the face, the hands, or the feet. The muscular system, we might see some twitching or prolonged spasms. And then in the digestive system, we might see some nausea and vomiting. Look over here, acidosis, similar symptoms. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea is a little different, right? Let's see. The other one's coma, okay? Sleepiness or tired, confusion over here, right? So some symptoms are kind of on, they can be on both sides, right? The respiratory system, you can see shortness of breath and coughing with acidosis, but you don't see really any respiratory symptoms of alkalosis, only on the acidosis side. The heart, we can see an increased heart rate, muscular system, seizures, and weakness. Okay. So make sure that you review these and that you can answer these questions. If you have any questions for me, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. See you guys soon. Bye.